Hey y'all, I'm Will Huntsberry. I'm an education reporter and one of the hosts of a show called Good Schools for All. It's a podcast all about schools, how they work and how they don't. This season will bring you stories about struggling schools, preschools, and an unprecedented scam that cost California tens of millions of dollars. Catch the new season now, wherever you listen to podcasts.
Thanks for joining us for this Voice of San Diego podcast bonus episode. I'm Scott Lewis, the CEO and editor-in-chief at Voice of San Diego. I have a friend, his name's Ramsey Green. He's been working for the city of New Orleans for a couple years now. He is from San Diego, and he and I got to talking about how the different cities were handling this moment, this crisis, and how they were doing it differently and the same. And I realized you all might be interested in that conversation. Ramsey is the Deputy Chief Administrative Officer for Infrastructure and Operations, and he has the title of Chief Resilience Officer. So for a place like New Orleans, where they basically have a disaster every month, it seems like, something huge to deal with, he has a very big job. So he and I talked about how Mardi Gras played a factor in New Orleans and in the outbreak of the coronavirus. And we talked about how New Orleans and San Diego stack up differently. So there's different rates of infection, but also a similar type of place, right? A lot of people come here and go there for a good time, for vacations, and how they handled things like schools and open spaces. So if you want a perspective of another city from somebody who grew up here in San Diego and has a lot of worldly experience, Ramsey's just a great conversation. And so listen to this, and I mean, really, the last 6 months, the last year they've had in New Orleans is amazing to listen to. So for those of you who are government wonks and want to hear how another government official handled things, I really recommend this. Thank you. You guys are always dealing with emergencies. There's floods, there's hurricanes, there's all kinds of things. You got through 2019. You ended up with a cyber attack, a horrible, they seized City Hall, right? The internet was just shut down. And you're probably getting into 2020 thinking like, let's have a clean, fresh start. Let's just get going.
But at the end of 2019, our mayor said, I remember her saying, man, 2019, what a buzzkill that year was. And then we move into 2020. The last 6 months, we had the collapse of the Hard Rock Hotel, which was a very tragic situation. 3 lost lives, hurt folks, businesses on the brink of just disaster adjacent to that site. And then in December, about a month or two after Hard Rock, we had a cyber attack, very, very costly cyber attack. Then we move into 2020 and we had, the things you get with an old city, a boil water advisory. We had an explosion at one of our turbines that generates power for our drainage system. And then we were on the front end of this pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, and that's where we are right now, very much so.
Yeah, the national discussion around New Orleans about this is that the assumption is that Mardi Gras really accelerated the situation, that it just festered it or somehow caused New Orleans to become one of these hot spots. Is that true? You were obviously involved in Mardi Gras. You're probably right there in the middle of it. How did it happen? And when did you go from, wow, this is something to, shut everything down?
So great question. And Scott, I think we've answered the Mardi Gras question, and our mayor puts it best that, Mardi Gras, I think, was February 25th. And for folks, in San Diego, again, I've got family out there. I'm a born native of San Diego, a big Padre fan. I got my Padre banner here on the wall. But I've been in New Orleans working for 13 years now. Mardi Gras is not a day. and Mardi Gras is actually about a 2 to 4 week thing, depending on how involved you get. So Mardi Gras is February 25th. So really, it was a big run up to that single day. And the federal government actually raised the amount of resources. There's actually a standard within the Department of Homeland Security called SEER. I forget what it stands for, but it's like Special Event Action Rating or something. And SEER 1 is the Super Bowl. We went from a SEER 3 to a SEER 2 for the first time this year, which meant that we had a federal coordinating officer from the Department of Homeland Security. And we had those resources during the planning for this event. And really at no time was COVID a thing. I walked the parade route, which is about 2.5, 3 miles or so, 5 or 6 times with the police department leadership. It's a tradition. The chief of police or the deputy chief walk on the front end, and then some of us in the city leadership walk adjacent to him. And we shook the hands of most, if not every one of the police officers stationed at every intersection. So you go down St. Charles Avenue, every block, there's 2 police officers at every intersection. I'm a type 1 diabetic, which means I essentially have an artificial pancreas in my pocket. So I am very aware of my own sort of medical conditions. I'm very well controlled, but I use hand sanitizer like a maniac when I was on that parade. But I never thought of coronavirus. And I'm somebody who reads, the news, and it was not something that we thought about as a contributing factor to the vulnerability of our public health. Our first diagnosis was March 9th, which I think was a Monday or a Tuesday. The Friday before, we did a tabletop of 3 different scenarios where we had 1 to 2 or 3 different people being diagnosed with COVID. And I remember looking at that and going through and thinking, oh, wow, this is kind of interesting. Our folks took it really seriously. And then it was not the top of mind for us. A week later, the next Friday, it was the only thing we were thinking about. That's how fast this thing hit us. We went from when the moment that we had that initial diagnosis, our mayor took the step of canceling the St. Patrick's Day parade, which is a big deal here in our neighborhood called Irish Channel. And she caught, as she said, she caught hell for it. She was excoriated. I probably said that word wrong, Scott. That's one of those words you read, but you don't often say. In the media, she was told, why are you canceling this? Within 24 hours, our rate quadrupled, and people thought, holy cow, this is a big threat, and people stopped saying that. We've taken this very seriously. And by that, I mean we are testing at a rate of testing our residents as of last week, and I'm probably going to get the statistic a little wrong. It's probably a little dated. If New Orleans were a country, we would have the 2nd highest rate of testing, only to Iceland. We have tested a full above 5% of our population. The state of Louisiana is also ahead. But to a degree, we are an island within an island surrounded by states that are a little, or I would say significantly behind on this. And, you don't want to think about being punished for taking the right action, but this hit us early, and it hit us at a high rate. And we have seen dramatic flattening of the curve since on or about April 7th, April 8th. And our residents have taken this immensely seriously.
One of the reasons you and I started talking again about what was happening was because we were comparing notes about open spaces, about parks. And, you grew up here, you know how important beaches and parks are to San Diego, and the mayor had shut them down completely after that first weekend when people sort of crowded them, and we just felt there was no way to do it other than to close them. And you explained to me how not only you just sort of let them go, you really did believe as a city that even though this was an emergency that you were taking extremely seriously, you needed to protect access to the open spaces that you could. Why was that so important, and how did that decision happen?
So it was actually one of those things that you do quickly. And, we've been very strategic about policy decisions, that we make them so we make them strategically so we don't have to walk them back. Some of the biggest ones are financial. Your personnel, this is having a huge impact on revenues for local governments. We did not want to announce anything too quickly because we needed to understand how big of a threat this was to our residents, but also to understand what's the federal government going to do for local cities, for cities and states. Parks was one of those things where we really consciously thought about it. It was about an hour-long decision, but we really looked at it as, number one, the folks who use green space are all of us. I do. I have a backyard. My children have a backyard. But there's nothing like getting into green space, particularly when you have to be at home all day. I have little children, and they need to get outside. And our weather right now is as beautiful as it ever is at any point in the year. But then there's kids who live with their parents, and they don't have a yard, or they live in a multifamily building, and they cannot get outside other than to go walk down a sidewalk. Parks are a big part of our city. It gives us mental stability, a connection to nature. And, for some people, going to a corner bar is their connection to what makes them feel good. For others, it's going to their grandma's house or their uncle's house, or going to, if you're a child, going to, after school baseball practice. We don't have those connections to people in ways that we did, 6, 7, 8 weeks ago. Parks are not a total replacement for it, but they are a good replacement for it. So we consciously looked at, okay, what elements of parks do not allow or are conducive to social distancing? Basketball is one. So I hated this as a basketball guy, but we removed all the rims. And where we couldn't remove the rims, we put, guards over the rims. We put caution tape over all playground equipment. We shut down all of our community centers. We shut down really elements of parks or recreation that you would touch. We launched our first week this happened. We call it Operation Deep Clean, where we used our mosquito and termite agency to come and just disinfect the heck out of all of our public assets, including our fire stations, our police stations, et cetera. And we realized within the first week that UV rays kill the disinfectant, so that's not going to work. So we caution taped it all off, and then we left our green spaces open. We have yard signs in all of those green spaces that say, stay 6 feet away. There is some science that says if you're running or riding a bike, stay further back because the air and the mixture of the droplets can move the air somewhere more aggressively. But in this environment, when we're seeing huge numbers of unemployment, in this environment, people need a mental place to relax, a physical way to relax. And that's what our green space have offered our folks. The city, this is one other thing I'll add, the city owns a golf course. And that first week, we're sitting around thinking, what do we do about the city golf course? And we talked, can you maintain social distancing while golfing? We believe you could, but to buy a ticket, you had to go into a place. So we moved that desk out. We restricted the use of golf carts because you're sitting too close to somebody. And then we shut down the pro shop so people can golf. And our folks, our leader in the parks department did a really good job. She said, let me call the places that are also facing this. And Washington, Seattle was the first place she called, and they kept their golf course open. We do have privately run parks that are more nonprofity. Private's the wrong word. Audubon Park, there is a golf course in the middle of Audubon Park. They decided to shut it down, but you know what's great? They have opened it up to passive use. So my wife and kids and I went and had a picnic on the rough, on the fairway adjacent to a pond, which is just beautiful. That is for us as my little family. Parks are a huge part of how we're getting through this right now.
New Orleans, when I've been there, obviously everybody's been there and they know it can be a rowdy place. There can be a lot of things happening, a lot of people out partying. Has it been hard to enforce, that people stay separate, that they, when you go to some of these places that they don't play basketball or that they don't intermingle? Are the police overburdened? Is there big crime problems, that sort of thing?
So we have, metrics that we get every day that say 311 or 911 have received X number of calls for social distance violations or whatever the terms are. By and large, 99% of those are resolved same moment, same day, whatever. I'll give you an example. We were at Lawrence Square, which is a park about 4 blocks from my front door. And my daughters and I, we do batting practice. We go out with a softball, and we do it. And we're out there. We've got our own, quarter of a block green space. No one's around. The playground's all taped off. But there's a basketball court directly across Napoleon Avenue. And there were guys playing basketball. And I sort of watched it, and I thought, man, I thought the rim should have been gone, but I don't know why it wasn't. Within 10 minutes of me noticing that, a police vehicle rolls up. Police officers don't even get out. They drive up. They get on the loudspeaker. They say, go home. Go home. Come on, guys. Go home. And the game broke up. Generally people in our city are some of the most resilient people. It's the reason I stayed here. I mean, this is a place where every summer you have to have a personal plan for how the heck to get out of town for a hurricane. That is a resilient group of people. That does not mean that people just listen to government because government says something. As long as we're honest with our folks, and our mayor is very much of this, she comes from a background as a community leader, and we explain, here's why, and here's the light at the end of the tunnel, people do it. And, it hasn't, as far as our enforcement, our code enforcement folks, our safety and permits folks, and our police, they seem to be very much on it. And Easter was one of those things where we really paid attention to it, and we saw a little bit of an uptick in violations. St. Patrick's Day, but that was very early on in this. I think people really get it now. And no one really wants to get this disease, this virus, and very few people want to transmit it to anybody, if anybody. So you kind of have to trust people a little bit.
One of the things we're watching is a little bit of a, street protest level push, very small protests, but not invisible. There have been some more formal sort of pleas for reopening businesses, restaurants. You mentioned that you're on a kind of island in the middle of the South in dealing with this, where a lot of other states around you aren't handling it in similar ways. Do you feel that same pressure? Are you seeing that same intense pressure that we're seeing in other places to get back, to move on, to get back and reignite the economy?
Yeah, there's a little bit of it, particularly over the last weekend. And our mayor uses a great phrase, and it is, we look at the data, not a date. Our focus is, and we're going to have some announcements about this between the state and the city in the next, several days. But if you look at the sort of Johns Hopkins recovery plan, which really has been echoed by the federal government, and then we're very much looking at it in accordance with the Louisiana Department of Health, there's 4 phases to recovery. To get from phase 1, where we are now, which many people use stay-at-home mandate, shutdown, whatever you call it, to phase 2, there are very specific metrics. And those are the metrics our folks in the public health side are really working out. But the notion is public health capacity needs to be there if this breaks out again. So what does that mean? That means that you're testing at a very aggressive rate, which we are. Very fortunately in New Orleans, we are testing aggressively. Our hospitals, while private sector, are very much working together. We were I think we were the first city government to do a mobile testing effort, where we had 3 different mobile testing unit drive-through. And then we actually shut that down because not enough people were going through again. So then we started this week called mobile testing, where we go into a neighborhood where the analytics tell us there aren't a lot of folks who have been tested, but we have a sense that there is, from analytics or data, telling us these are folks who ought to be tested, whether it's a high rate of other public health comorbidities or whatever it is. So we started that this week, where people walk up, they get in a line, they're 6 to 8 feet apart from each other. There's tape on the ground that tells you where to stand. So we are doing that. We are meeting the metrics of testing, but we also need to see, 14 to 21 days of a steadily declining number of new infections. Right now, our state stay-at-home order expires at the end of this month. Our city one expires somewhere around May 16th. Really, those dates are kind of like 30-day increment dates. The city was a few days ahead of the state, and then the state rolled, and our governor and our mayor worked very closely together to ensure that we're doing this in a coordinated logical effort based on the data. But I think the best message that we give the business community is we explain exactly what we're doing and why. And when we don't, they tell us. They say, hey, we need to reopen. As long as we're explaining the what's happening, people are more patient. Every day we get our numbers at noon, and today our numbers were 27 new infections and 23 dead. Every day at noon we get those numbers. We have around 340 of our residents have died since March. I want to say our first fatality was March 14th or 15th. The second fatality was a personal friend of the mayor. I have a list on my phone of people I know who've died, and we can't have funerals. I think that's a very compelling reason to take this seriously, as opposed to choosing an arbitrary date to get an economy going again.
You spent so much time in the classroom and then later administering and building schools. You've designed schools, you've seen schools work, you were involved with that. I think schools are one of the most important things we can put on any list about reopening. It's hard to imagine reopening anything without a place that parents can depend on to advance their child's education, take care of them through the day. Do you think people will go back to school and be able to have what we know of as a normal education with other kids in the next year, 2 years?
So, Scott, you raise a fantastic question. I think about that as a parent. Particularly, I have a 5-year-old who loves zoo camp. And I have real doubts as to whether zoo camp is going to happen this year. I haven't told her that. And I'm going to wait until we, as a city, are able to figure out our next step based on the data. But something I do know is that since the time of when humans have been present on this earth, we have faced pandemics. And all of them end. And then we move on. My dad, who lives in Bankers Hill, uses the phrase the new normal. And I said, Dad, there's no new normal. We're going to get past this. It's going to take some time. We will get past this. This is a new thing for me at my age. It's a little, I work with a gentleman who's in his late 60s, and he was telling me about when he was a kid and dealing with measles. And he said, oh man, we just, everybody got in the house. And I thought, wow, he's a little more experienced with this. He also spent 20 years as a chem bio officer in the Marine Corps. So he's a little more patient with this stuff than I think some of us normal folks are. We will get through this. Kids will be able to go back to school. I think next year may be a little different. They're going to have to, I think the popular consensus, if you look at the science and the data and the folks who are experts on this will tell you, things are going to be a little different for a little while. But children need to be educated, and they need to be around other kids. And the more, I would really encourage your listeners to look at that Johns Hopkins report, because it talks about phase 3 and phase 4 and what it means to put children together and how do you do it. In our public schools, over 90% of our average school has children who get free lunch or reduced lunch. And this is one of those things where I take immense pride in this. The COO of the school system was a woman named Tiffany Delcourt. I hired her years ago at the school system, and she's gotten promoted. She's done an incredible job. The schools, the charter school leaders, the school system has fed tens of thousands of meals to those children and their families every day since this broke out and we had to shut schools down. Other parishes in our state shut it down the moment somebody was diagnosed in the delivery end of schools with COVID. worst public health outcome than COVID is children starving. Serving tens of thousands of meals every week, every day is one of those things that we have kept going despite people dying and people getting sick. And then logistically scheduling out how to get meals to people despite the day challenge of this person just got diagnosed. We have to go do, contact tracing, et cetera. Our schools in our city matter. And we are doing the thoughtful work as a community to ensure that they continue in as safe a way as possible. And I would really urge San Diego to do the same thing. I grew up in public schools in San Diego, Grant Elementary School, Correa Junior High, Point Loma High. They can do it. It just takes some real flexibility and some real responsibility.
Yeah. Well, thank you. And thanks for representing out there and taking care of. So across from one city that's very similar to another city, all going through this together, take care of your own and also your city. I'm proud of what you're doing there. And we'll get through this and be able to share stories. So thanks again, Ramsey.
I really appreciate this, Scott. I've been looking forward to this since you sent me the email because it just is fun to be in touch with people from San Diego. My mother has since left. My dad is still there. My dad, Steve Green. Hey, Dad. And I have so many great friends in San Diego. My high school English teacher, Larry Zeiger, he and I text regularly. Thanks for the time. This is something that really appreciate.
This episode of the Voice of San Diego podcast was hosted by Scott Lewis, produced and edited by me, Nate John. Special thanks to Ramsey Green.